Charles is autistic. His wife, Martha, is not. They've been married for 23 years, which means they love each other deeply and have also accumulated 23 years of evidence that neither one has any idea what the other person is doing. People describe Charles and Martha as a neurodiverse couple. That sounds sophisticated. It sounds like something you'd read on a brochure for a progressive private school. We celebrate neurodiversity. Charles prefers a simpler definition. A neurodiverse marriage is two people living in the same house, having the same conversation, and somehow leaving with completely different transcripts. Martha communicates through words, facial expressions, tone of voice, posture, pauses, size, eye contact, context, timing, historical precedent, and a mysterious communications network known as "you know what I mean." Charles does not know what she means. That's pretty much the problem. Charles communicates through words, actual words. Martha finds this limitation astonishing. One evening, they're sitting in the living room, and Martha says, "It's getting cold in here." Charles looks up and says, "Yeah." And then he goes back to watching television. Martha looks at him. Charles doesn't notice. She looks at him harder. Still nothing. Eventually, she gets up, walks over to the thermostat, and turns up the heat. She sits back down and says, "You could have done that." Charles looks confused. "Done what?" "Turn up the heat." "Well, you didn't ask me to turn up the heat." "Well, I said I was cold." "Yes, I agreed with you." Charles genuinely believes they had a successful conversation there. Martha provided meteorological information about the living room. Charles confirmed her feelings. Case closed. Martha, meanwhile, believes she married a man who watched his wife slowly freeze to death from 6 feet away. Charles doesn't understand why weather reports come with assignments. If Martha wants the thermostat changed, Charles would greatly appreciate that sentence. "Charles, would you turn up the thermostat?" That's a beautiful sentence. There's a subject, a verb, and an objective. Everyone knows what we're doing, but Martha speaks hint. Hint is a language where you describe a situation, wait for the other person to infer what you want, and then become disappointed when they fail the exam they didn't know they were taking. Charles doesn't like to speak hint. He barely has a Rosetta Stone. He especially struggles with one of Martha's favorite phrases, "Do whatever you want." Guys, if your wife is mad and she says, "Do whatever you want," that doesn't mean do whatever you want without consequences. Early in the marriage, Charles made the mistake of believing this sentence. Martha once said, "If you'd rather stay home tonight, do whatever you want." Charles said, "Okay." He stayed home. Charles learned something very important that night. Do whatever you want doesn't mean do whatever you want. It means there is exactly one acceptable choice, and Martha is interested in finding out whether Charles loves her enough to locate it without assistance. It's not permission. It's a marital pop quiz. The correct response was apparently, "No, Martha, I'd much rather go with you." Charles didn't do that. Nobody told Charles the marriage contained trick questions. Now, whenever Martha says, "Do whatever you want," Charles becomes very still. He learned not to touch anything. Then there's the typical NT statement, "I'm fine." Charles has been studying "I'm fine" for 23 years, and he's made very little progress. Sometimes Martha says she's fine because she's fine. Sometimes she says she's fine because she's irritated. Sometimes she says "I'm fine" when she's hurt or furious. And sometimes she says, "No, seriously, Charles, I'm fine." Charles has learned that this is the least fine Martha can possibly be. Apparently, the entire meaning of the sentence depends on tone. This is unfortunate because Charles is autistic and doesn't get tone. Asking him to decode 17 varieties of fine based on vocal inflection is like handing a colorblind man paint samples and asking him to find mauve. Martha says, "I'm fine." Charles thinks, that was louder. She must be extremely fine. He's also discovered that Martha's eyebrows apparently have Wi-Fi. They'll be at a party when somebody says, "You guys should stay. We're opening another bottle of wine." Martha looks at Charles. Charles looks at Martha. Martha raises an eyebrow. Charles smiles. Later in the car, Martha says, "I was signaling that I wanted to leave." Charles is stunned. "With an eyebrow?" "Yes. I thought you had something in your eye." If Martha stood across the room waving 2 illuminated orange batons towards the front door, Charles would have a fighting chance. Oh, she wants to leave now. Perfect. He could work with that. Of course, Martha isn't the only difficult person in this marriage. Charles has systems. Charles doesn't believe he has many systems. Martha has compiled evidence suggesting otherwise. There is a correct coffee mug, a correct chair, only one route to go to the grocery store, only one method for folding towels, and there is a correct spoon. Martha calls it Charles' special spoon. Charles hates that. It's not my special spoon. Every house has inferior silverware. Nobody talks about this. There's always one fork with a bizarre handle. Nobody likes it. It's been sitting in the drawer since 2009, waiting to ruin somebody's lasagna. Charles knows which utensils are structurally sound. He has done the research. Then there is the dishwasher. The dishwasher has nearly ended the marriage many times. Martha believes there is no wrong way to load the dishwasher. Charles believes this is the kind of thinking that leads to the collapse of civilizations. Martha loads dishes according to a simple philosophy: put shit in there until the door won't close. Charles opens the dishwasher and experiences what can only be described as a neurological emergency. Bowls facing upward, plates are touching, a large pan is blocking the spray arm. Charles goes silent, and Martha notices. What? Nothing. Charles, it's fine. Now Charles is speaking Martha. Martha watches as he begins rearranging everything. Why do you always reload the dishwasher after I load it? I'm not reloading it. What are you doing? I'm optimizing it. That's worse. Charles explains that water must actually reach the dishes. Martha explains that she has somehow survived 48 years without receiving a lecture on fluid dynamics from her husband. Charles points toward the bottom rack. If you put the pan there, it blocks the spray pattern. The spray pattern? And suddenly, Martha realizes she's married the chef hydraulic engineer of KitchenAid. Charles, it's a dishwasher. Yes? We're not launching a space shuttle. No, but there's still principles involved. There are always principles involved with Charles. Martha moved a bowl. Charles has constitutional concerns. But the real fun begins when Martha has a bad day. One afternoon, Martha comes home and throws her purse onto the counter. My boss is such an asshole. Charles immediately becomes interested. A problem, finally. Charles understands problems. Problems have causes, and problems have solutions. And problems don't say, do whatever you want, and then become angry when you do. So Charles says, what happened? Martha explains. Charles listens carefully. He identifies 3 inconsistencies in her boss's behavior, 2 possible strategies, and a potential HR issue, and a more efficient organizational structure for Martha's entire department. He's ready. And he says, all right, here's what you need to do. Martha sighs. I don't want you to tell me what to do. Charles freezes. Then why the hell did we open up this case? Martha says, I just need you to listen. Charles doesn't do this naturally. To Charles, Martha has brought him a broken situation. He has opened up his toolbox. Apparently, Martha doesn't want the toolbox. She wants Charles to sit next to the broken situation and feel bad about it with her. That strikes Charles as a terrible repair strategy. But eventually, Charles learns the greatest sentence ever invented for a neurodiverse marriage. Martha, do you want me to listen, ask questions, or help you solve it? The first time Charles said that, Martha almost fell out of her chair. Oh, well, I want you to listen. Charles nods. Excellent. He finally received instructions. Just listen. Charles loves instructions, so he listens. Martha feels supported. Charles doesn't accidentally restructure her workplace. Everybody wins. Then there's sex. Sex presents Charles and Martha with several additional communication challenges because Martha believes seduction should involve subtle signs. Charles has already demonstrated that subtle signs are not exactly his department. One evening, Martha changes into something sexy. She dims the lights. She sits beside Charles on the couch. She moves closer. Charles notices. He thinks, Martha is sitting closer. Martha touches his leg. Charles thinks, that was nice. She rests her head on his shoulders. Charles thinks, she must be tired. Finally, Martha gets up. I'm going to bed. Charles says, okay, sleep well. Martha walks upstairs wondering how she married the only heterosexual man in America capable of missing an invitation that included lingerie. Charles stays downstairs wondering why Martha went to bed so early. The next morning, she says, you didn't pick up on anything last night, did you? Charles looks concerned and says, well, were you sick? Martha stares at him. No, Charles, I was trying to have sex with you. Charles says, oh. Charles thinks about this. You know, you could have just said that. Apparently that isn't romantic. Charles doesn't understand why. They're married. They've seen each other's vomit. They've assembled furniture together. They've survived stomach flu simultaneously. The mystery left the building years ago. Charles thinks, hey, would you like to have sex? It's a wonderful sentence. It's clear, it's efficient, very little chance of misunderstanding there. But Martha thinks it sounds like she's scheduling a dental cleaning. Martha wants spontaneity. Charles would prefer a calendar invitation. Tuesday, 8:30 p.m. Sex, location, bedroom. Agenda attached. Charles could arrive at 8:27. Martha says scheduling sex isn't romantic. Charles points out that they schedule everything else they consider important: vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, doctor's appointments, even the dog gets an appointment. Apparently, sex is the only important event that becomes less meaningful if everyone knows when it's happening. Then Charles and Martha argue. Martha argues emotionally. Charles argues like he's appealing a parking citation. Martha says, "You always do this." Charles hears only one word: always. His brain immediately abandons the emotional content of the conversation and begins reviewing historical records. That's technically inaccurate, Martha. There it is, technically. The most dangerous word in the neurodiverse marriage. Nothing good has ever happened after a husband says, "Well, technically is gasoline with a lit match." Martha says, "You never listen to me." Charles says, "Well, that's demonstrably false." Oh, excellent. Now we're using the term demonstrably. That'll calm things down. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk.